My son-in-law believed the key to my safe was the key to his future. He was right, just not in the way he imagined. He thought he would find my life savings. Instead, he found a meticulously crafted document that would end his. What he did in the dark of my study, thinking I was asleep, brought a truth to light that would shatter our family and ultimately set my daughter free. Before I tell you how we got to that night, a night that changed everything, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please tell me in the comments below. And if you've ever had to draw a line in the sand with your own family, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps to know you're not alone. The whole thing started as so many endings do over a meal I didn't want to be at. The restaurant was the kind of place Kevin, my son-in-law, loved. It was loud, overpriced, and full of people performing their success for one another. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of self-important conversations felt like a language I no longer understood. Across the table, Kevin swirled a glass of red wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. He had this look on his face, a mixture of arrogance and desperation I had come to know all too well. My daughter Sarah sat beside him, looking pale and tired, picking at a salad she had no intention of eating. After his second glass, Kevin leaned forward, placing his hands on the table as if he were about to announce a corporate merger. He had that predatory gleam in his eye, the one he gets when he smells money. My money. "Jack," he began, his voice a little too loud, drawing the attention of the couple at the next table. "We need to have a serious talk about your assets." I just looked at him, my fork halfway to my mouth. He didn't wait for a response. He was on a roll now, the wine having oiled the gears of his greed. "You're sitting on a gold mine, a literal gold mine. That house paid off for 30 years. The savings, the investments, it's just dead money, Jack. It's not doing anything." He gestured expansively with his hand, nearly knocking over his wineglass. "The market is ripe for opportunity right now. I have this new venture, a real game changer. We're talking a 500% return in 18 months. But it needs capital. It needs vision." He then had the audacity to place a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You want to see Sarah live the life she deserves, don't you? You don't want her to have to worry about the future, do you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, painting me as a selfish old man holding my own daughter back from happiness. I looked at Sarah, pleading with my eyes for her to say something, to defend me, to draw a boundary. But she just stared down at her lap, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Her silence was her answer. It was a betrayal far deeper than any word Kevin could have spoken. It told me that on some level she agreed with him, that she saw me not as her father, but as a bank. The noise of the restaurant faded away. All I could hear was the ticking of a clock that wasn't there, marking the final seconds of the family I thought I had. I slowly placed my fork and knife on the plate. I looked at Kevin's smug face, then at my daughter's averted gaze. I felt a profound coldness spread through my chest, extinguishing the last embers of hope. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and placed $60 on the table to cover my meal and a generous tip. I stood up, my joints aching a little. "I'm feeling a little tired," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside me. "You two enjoy the rest of your evening." And I walked out, leaving them sitting in the expensive, suffocating silence. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and memories. Each red light was a pause, a moment, for another failure to surface. I remembered the $5,000 I'd given Kevin 5 years ago for a can't-miss tech startup that disappeared without a trace. He had called it seed money. I now realized he was just planting seeds of deceit. I remembered the $10,000 2 years later, a short-term loan to help his marketing business through a cash flow crisis. That money was never mentioned again. Worst of all, I remembered the conversation I overheard a year ago, when Kevin was pressuring Sarah to cash in the savings bonds her mother had left her. "It's our money, honey," he had said, his voice a venomous whisper. "It's for our future." My wife, gone for a decade, had meticulously saved that money to give Sarah a safety net, a piece of security that was hers alone. And Kevin had convinced her to burn it on one of his fleeting fantasies. This wasn't the first time he had come for my family's security. But as I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, I swore to myself that it would be the last. I walked into the house I had shared with my wife for 40 years. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew every inch of this place by heart. I sat down in my old armchair in the living room, the darkness wrapping around me like a blanket. The house was utterly silent, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. For an hour, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it all. The grief for the daughter I had lost. The rage at the man who had taken her from me. The disappointment in myself for letting it go on for so long. Then something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It turned from a hot, messy emotion into something cold, hard, and sharp. The fog of grief lifted, and in its place was the absolute clarity of purpose. I was no longer just a sad old man. I was Jack Caldwell. For 40 years, my job had been to look at a company's books and find the story hidden within the numbers. I hunted for fraud. I uncovered lies buried in spreadsheets and financial statements. I had been retired for 7 years, but the skills I realized don't just vanish. They lie dormant, waiting for a reason to be used. And Kevin had just given me the best reason of my life. I stood up and walked into my small home office. I powered on my old desktop computer. It whirred to life a familiar, comforting sound. I navigated to a folder hidden deep within the hard drive, a folder protected by a complex password. Inside was a single encrypted Excel file. I opened it. It was a personal ledger I had kept for years, a habit from my professional life. I created a new tab at the bottom of the spreadsheet. I didn't label it Kevin or family problem. I labeled it with the precision of my former life. I typed case file Riley Kevin. In the first cell, under a column labeled date, I entered today's date. Under a column labeled event, I wrote public solicitation of assets at dinner. S. Caldwell complicit through silence. And under a final column labeled action required, I wrote a single sentence. Initiate full financial and background investigation. Objective asset protection and risk mitigation. The war had begun, and he didn't even know it. In the weeks that followed, my home became an observation post. I was no longer a father or a grandfather, but an intelligence analyst gathering data on a hostile target. When Sarah and Kevin came over for their now obligatory Sunday visits, I watched them with a new detached clarity. I noticed things I had previously dismissed. The way Kevin never quite looked me in the eye. The way Sarah's laughter never reached her own. They were performing a version of happiness, and I was the audience they were trying to fool. One Sunday, a glint of gold on Kevin's wrist caught my eye. It was a new watch, a heavy, ostentatious thing with a brand name I recognized as absurdly expensive. He saw me looking at it and casually pulled his sleeve down. Just a little something I treated myself to, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Business has been tough. You gotta celebrate the small wins, you know. This was less than a month after he'd publicly shamed me for not liquidating my life savings for his game-changing venture. The contradiction was so blatant, so insulting, it was almost comical. I just nodded slowly, filing the observation away in my mental case file. Later that afternoon, while I was pretending to be engrossed in a book in the living room, Kevin stepped out into the backyard to take a call. I positioned myself near the kitchen window, which overlooked the patio. His voice was low and tense, a stark contrast to the easygoing charm he projected indoors. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Phrases drifted through the screen door like toxic pollen. Need another extension. I told you the payment is coming. Just a slight delay. And then more urgently. Look, I can't talk now. Don't call this number again. Don't call the house. He hung up and stood there for a long moment, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his shoulders slumped. When he walked back inside, the charming mask was perfectly back in place. He asked Sarah if she was ready to go, and the performance was over for the day. My neighbor Maria Flores came over for coffee the next morning. She's a retired paralegal, sharp as a tack, with a no-nonsense attitude that I've always appreciated. We sat on my porch watching the world go by, a ritual we'd maintained for years. It was the only place I felt I could speak with any degree of honesty. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. But I told her about the dinner, about the pressure. Maria listened patiently, her gaze fixed on the street. When I finished, she took a slow sip of her coffee. "Jack," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "how much have you given them over the years?" The question was direct, and it made me uncomfortable. I started to deflect, but she held up a hand. "I'm not judging. I'm asking as a friend, because what you described isn't a son-in-law asking for help. It's a predator testing the fences." Her words hit home. I found myself telling her about the down payment I'd given them for their first house, a sum that had taken a significant bite out of my retirement fund. I told her how I'd justified it to myself, telling myself it was an investment in my daughter's happiness. "That wasn't an investment, Jack," Maria said softly. "That was a bailout. And once you bail someone out, they learn that they don't have to learn how to swim." She pointed a finger at me. "That dinner, the public pressure, the talk about dead money, those are all giant flapping red flags. He's testing you. He's seeing how far he can push before you break." Her legal mind was already at work. "You need to protect yourself, Jack. Not just your money, your home, your peace of mind." Her advice solidified the vague plan that had been forming in my mind. It was time to stop observing and start building my defenses. The next day, I had a new security system installed. I told Sarah and Kevin it was because I was getting older, a little more forgetful, and wanted the extra security. Kevin thought it was a fantastic idea. "Can't be too careful these days, Jack," he said, clapping me on the back. He had no idea he was applauding the construction of his own cage. The system came with 4 cameras. I had one placed over the front door, one over the back, and one covering the driveway. The 4th one I had the technician install myself after he left. It was a small, discreet dome camera barely noticeable in the corner of my study. It had a perfect high-definition view of the old steel gray safe that sat in the corner, the safe Kevin believed held the solution to all his problems. The trap was now set. All I needed was the evidence to bait it. My own home was no longer a secure place for my investigation. I started going to the public library 3 towns over. It was anonymous, quiet, and had free high-speed internet. I felt a familiar thrill as I sat down at a carrel in the back, the smell of old books and dust in the air. It was the thrill of the hunt. I was back in my element. I started with public records, the foundation of any financial investigation. I searched for businesses registered under Kevin Riley's name. A list of 6 LLCs popped up. On the surface, it looked impressive, like a portfolio of a busy entrepreneur. But I knew better. I cross-referenced the business addresses. One was a P.O. box at a UPS store. 2 others were registered to a single address in Delaware, a notorious haven for shell corporations. The others were linked to virtual office services in different states. There was no brick-and-mortar reality to any of it. They were ghosts created to give the illusion of substance. This was a classic shell game. Next, I moved to the darker corners of the internet. I searched for Kevin's name and the names of his phantom companies on investor forums and watchdog sites. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A thread on a small-cap investment forum was titled, "Warning Kevin Riley and Future Vest Scam." My blood ran cold. I clicked the link. I spent the next 2 hours reading through a litany of heartache and anger. Dozens of people, small-time investors, retirees, people who had been convinced to part with their savings, all telling the same story. Kevin had charmed them with promises of incredible returns from a revolutionary new technology. He had shown them glossy brochures and fake testimonials. He had created a sense of urgency of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Then, after they had wired the money, the communication would become sporadic. The promised updates never came. The website went dark. Kevin Riley, the charismatic visionary, simply vanished, leaving them with nothing but empty promises and even emptier bank accounts. I printed every single post, the pages piled up next to the library computer, a monument to his cruelty. He wasn't just a failed businessman struggling to make it. He was a professional predator who preyed on trust and hope. He wasn't just a danger to my financial security. He was a danger to my daughter, and I had unknowingly invited him into the very heart of my family. I stacked the printed pages into a neat pile, my hands steady. The anger was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. But now it had a companion, absolute, unwavering resolve. I wasn't just building a defense anymore. I was building a case. My own home was no longer a secure place for my investigation. It was a stage, and I was merely an actor on it. The real work, the deep work, had to be done elsewhere. So I began a new routine. 3 times a week, I would drive to the public library in a town 20 miles away, a place where no one knew my face. I felt a familiar thrill as I sat down at a carrel in the back, the smell of old books and dust in the air. It was the thrill of the hunt. I was back in my element, a forensic accountant on the trail of a lie. I started with the basics, the digital breadcrumbs that everyone leaves behind. I searched for businesses registered under Kevin Riley's name in the State Commerce Database. A list of 6 limited liability companies, or LLCs, popped up. On the surface, it looked impressive, like the portfolio of a busy, diversified entrepreneur. But I knew that a company's registration is just its public face. The real story is always in the details. I clicked on the first one, Riley Innovations LLC. The address listed was a mail service in a strip mall. The second, Apex Global Ventures, was registered to a P.O. box at a UPS store. The third and fourth were linked to a single address in Delaware, a notorious haven for anonymous shell corporations. They were ghosts, digital entities created to give the illusion of substance where there was none. This wasn't the footprint of a legitimate businessman. This was the work of a con artist building a house of cards. A man who wanted to look successful without ever creating a single thing of value. For a man like me who had spent his life valuing tangible assets and honest labor, it was a profound insult. With the corporate structures mapped out, I moved to the darker corners of the internet. I started searching for Kevin's name and the names of his phantom companies on investor forums and watchdog sites. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The internet never truly forgets. I found a thread on a small-cap investment forum that made my blood run cold. It was titled in all caps, "Warning Kevin Riley and Future Vest Global Scam." Future Vest Global was the 5th LLC on my list. I clicked the link. For the next 2 hours, I didn't move. I read through a litany of heartache and anger. Dozens of people, small-time investors, retirees, a teacher who had invested her pension, a young couple who had used their wedding savings, all telling the same sickeningly familiar story. Kevin had charmed them. He had found them through social clubs, church groups, and local business meetups. He had dazzled them with promises of incredible returns from a revolutionary new green energy technology. He had shown them glossy brochures, sophisticated-looking charts, and fake testimonials from satisfied clients. He had created a sense of intense urgency of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would close at any moment. Then, after they had wired the money to the Future Vest Global account, the communication would become sporadic. The promised monthly updates never came. The company's website suddenly went dark, and Kevin Riley, the charismatic visionary who had been their friend and financial savior, simply vanished. The phone number was disconnected. The emails bounced back. He left them with nothing but worthless stock certificates, empty promises, and the devastating shame of having been so thoroughly fooled. I printed every single post, every accusation, every desperate plea for information. The pages piled up next to the library computer, a monument to his cruelty. He wasn't just a failed businessman struggling to get by. He was a professional predator who fed on the trust and hope of good people. He wasn't just a threat to my financial security. He was a moral black hole, and he was sleeping in my daughter's bed. I had welcomed him into my home. I had shaken his hand. I neatly stacked the printed pages, my hands perfectly steady. The anger was still there. Of course, a cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach. But it had been refined. It was no longer a messy, emotional reaction. It was a cold, pure fuel. My objective had changed. This was no longer about protecting my assets. This was about justice. It was about honoring the memory of my wife who had always been wary of Kevin. It was about saving my daughter from the man she couldn't see. I wasn't just building a defense anymore. I was building a case. And I would be the most meticulous, relentless prosecutor he had ever faced. The evidence I had gathered at the library felt like a lead weight in my briefcase. It was a collection of raw data, a story of deceit told in screenshots and public filings. But data alone is powerless. To have any real effect, it needed to be shaped into a tool, or better yet, a weapon. And for that, I needed a specialist. Maria had given me a name written on a small, crisp business card. David Sterling, attorney at law. The card said he specialized in estate planning and asset protection. It was exactly what I needed. His office was in an old, respectable brick building downtown, the kind with a heavy oak door that closes with a satisfying thud. The air inside smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and quiet confidence. There were no flashy modern art pieces on the walls, just framed diplomas and shelves of leather-bound legal books that looked like they had been there for a century. It was a room that promised discretion and competence. David Sterling was a man in his late 60s with a calm, observant gaze that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as I laid out my situation. I didn't present the evidence of Kevin's scams just yet. That was for a different phase of the battle. For now, I presented the problem in the driest, most objective terms possible. I told him I had a single heir, my daughter Sarah. I told him I was concerned that her husband, Kevin Riley, was financially reckless and manipulative. My stated goal, I explained, was to ensure that the assets I had spent a lifetime accumulating would be preserved for my daughter's long-term security and protected from the influence and potential claims of her current husband. He nodded slowly, processing the information. "The most straightforward approach, Jack," he said, his voice measured, "is to amend your will. We can structure it to place her inheritance into a testamentary trust that activates upon your passing, with a third-party trustee to manage the funds." I had already thought of that. "That's not enough," I replied, leaning forward. "A will can be contested. After I'm gone, Kevin could try to have Sarah challenge it. He could hire lawyers to claim I wasn't of sound mind, that my daughter unduly influenced me against him. It would become a long, expensive, and ugly fight, and he would drain her inheritance, paying the legal fees. I need something more permanent. I need a fortress." A flicker of understanding crossed Sterling's face. He recognized the word. He knew what kind of client I was. I wasn't just planning for death. I was preparing for war. "I see," he said, steepling his fingers. "In that case, we are not talking about a will. We are talking about an irrevocable trust." He explained it to me, though I already knew the basics. It was a separate legal entity. I would transfer my assets, the house, the investment portfolio, the savings, into the ownership of the trust. I would no longer own them directly. The trust would. I could be the trustee for as long as I lived managing the assets, but they would be legally insulated, shielded from any future claims, creditors, or lawsuits. They would be beyond Kevin's reach now and forever. It was exactly the fortress I needed. "The trust will have one beneficiary," I stated. "My daughter Sarah." "And the terms of distribution?" Sterling asked, pulling a notepad closer. This was the moment. This was the keystone of the entire structure. The trust will provide for her basic needs and any medical emergencies throughout her life managed by a corporate trustee after I'm gone. I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. However, the full principle of the trust, the entire inheritance, will only be distributed to her outright under one specific condition. I paused, meeting his gaze. That she is no longer legally married to Kevin Riley, either through his death or through a dissolution of their marriage. Sterling's pen stopped moving. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. The professional calm in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of human curiosity. This was more than just asset protection. This was personal. That's a very specific and very restrictive condition, Jack. A court might see it as punitive. Are you certain? I leaned back in the reassuring weight of the leather chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. David, I said, using his first name for the first time. Let me tell you about my wife, Carolyn. I told him how when Sarah first brought Kevin home 20 years ago, Carolyn had been polite, charming even. But later that night, after he had left, she and I were sitting on the porch swing. I remembered the scent of her night-blooming jasmine in the air. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said something I never forgot. There's a hunger in that young man's eyes, she'd whispered. And it's not for our daughter. It's for what he thinks our daughter can give him. I had dismissed it at the time as a mother's overprotectiveness. I had seen a charismatic, ambitious young man. She had seen a predator. As the years went on and Carolyn's health began to fail, her worries about Kevin only grew. In her final months, we had a conversation in her hospital room. She made me promise. Protect her, Jack. She had pleaded, her voice weak. When I'm gone, you have to be the one who sees clearly for both of us. Protect our girl from him. I had promised, but for 10 years since her passing, I had failed. I had chosen peace over protection. I had enabled Kevin's behavior with my silence and my checkbook, all to avoid conflict, to avoid upsetting Sarah. I'm not doing this to punish him, I told Sterling, my voice thick with emotion I didn't try to hide. I am doing this to fulfill a promise to my wife. I am building the walls around my daughter that I failed to build for the last decade. This trust isn't a punishment. It's a protection. It's a lifeboat. She can choose to get in it, or she can choose to stay on his sinking ship. But the choice will be hers, and the lifeboat will be there waiting for her. David Sterling listened to the entire story without a word. When I finished, the professional distance was gone. He simply nodded. I understand completely, Jack, he said. We will draft the documents exactly as you've specified. The lifeboat will be ready. The next week, I returned to his office to sign the papers. The documents were thick, full of dense legal language, but I knew what they meant. I was signing away my house. I was signing away my life savings. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I wrote my name over and over again. Each letter was a brick being laid in the wall of the fortress. Each signature was a nail hammered into the coffin of Kevin Riley's ambitions. When I finished, I felt a strange sense of lightness. I had given up ownership of everything I had, but in doing so, I had taken back something far more valuable: control. I walked out of that office into the bright afternoon sun. The fortress was built. The next move was his. The legal fortress was built, its walls invisible but stronger than steel. The irrevocable trust ensured that my legacy would be protected from the outside. But I knew Kevin. He wouldn't attack the fortress from the outside with lawyers. His method was to get inside, to act like a thief in the night, to take what he believed was his by right. My next task was to prepare a welcome for him. The evidence I had gathered from the library was damning, but it was circumstantial. It showed a pattern of deceit. I needed something more. I needed a smoking gun. I needed a crime. There was a loose thread I hadn't been able to pull on my own, a reference in one of the forums to a large injection of cash into one of Kevin's shell companies about 2 years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic. The timing was suspicious. It was time to call in a favor. I reached out to Ben Carter, a young man I had mentored during my last few years at the firm. I had taught him the old-school art of following a paper trail, and he had taught me that in the modern world, every piece of paper also had a digital ghost. He was now a top cybersecurity analyst, and he owed me one for helping him land his first big promotion. I called him on a secure line. "Ben," I said, getting straight to the point, "I need you to look into something for me off the books. It's a personal matter." I gave him the name of Kevin's LLC and the approximate date of the transaction. "I just have a bad feeling about it. Can you see where the money came from?" Ben was quiet for a moment. "You know I can't access bank records directly, Jack. That's illegal." "I know," I replied. "I'm not asking you to, but government disbursements, certain types of loans, those leave a public footprint if you know where to look. Just see what you can find in the public domain. Treat it like a puzzle." He chuckled. "You always did love a good puzzle." "All right, Jack. For you, I'll take a look. I'll call you back in a day or two." He called back in 6 hours. The speed of the call told me he had found something significant. "Jack," he said, and the usual cheerfulness was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a grim professionalism. "Are you sitting down?" "I am," I said, my grip tightening on the receiver. "The cash infusion wasn't an investment," Ben said. "It was a loan. Specifically, it was a Paycheck Protection Program loan, a PPP loan." The air went out of my lungs. The PPP loans were part of the government's COVID-19 relief effort, designed to help small businesses keep their employees on the payroll during the lockdowns. The rules were strict, and the penalties for fraud were severe. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. $150,000, Ben replied. He applied through an online lender claiming his company, Riley Innovations LLC, had 15 employees and a monthly payroll of $60,000. I looked at the corporate filings I had printed out, which were spread across my desk. Riley Innovations LLC, registered to a P.O. box. The company had no physical address, no website, and according to the state tax records I had pulled, it had never once filed payroll taxes, because it had never had a single employee. "It's fraud, Ben, isn't it?" I said, though I already knew the answer. "It's not just fraud, Jack," Ben said, his voice low and serious. "This is a federal crime. Wire fraud, bank fraud. They don't take this stuff lightly. People are doing serious time for this. I'm sending you the encrypted file with the application number and the public confirmation of the loan forgiveness he applied for and received. He claimed he used the money to save 15 jobs that never existed, and the government wiped the loan clean. He just pocketed the cash." Ben paused. "Whatever this guy has done to you, Jack, it's 100 times worse than you thought. Be careful." After I hung up the phone, I sat in silence for a long time. The final piece of the puzzle had just slammed into place. This was the smoking gun. This was the crime. Kevin hadn't just scammed a few hopeful investors. He had stolen from the American people during a national crisis. He had exploited a tragedy for personal gain. Any lingering shred of sympathy I might have had for him, any thought that he was just a desperate man making bad choices, evaporated in that moment. Then I went to work. I drove to a 24-hour copy shop, and for the next 3 hours I meticulously assembled my case. I printed Ben's findings, the hard proof of the fraudulent PPP loan application and its forgiveness. I printed the corporate registration documents for all 6 of his shell companies. I printed every single post from the investor forums highlighting Kevin's name each time it appeared. I created charts showing the flow of money into his accounts and the complete lack of any legitimate business activity coming out. I worked with the focus and precision of my old life, my hands moving with a purpose they hadn't felt in years. I three-hole punched every page. I organized them chronologically with dated tabs for each section. The investor complaints, the corporate shell game, the federal loan fraud. When I was done, I slid the nearly 200 pages into a heavy-duty 3-ring binder. I took a black permanent marker and a ruler, and in neat block letters I wrote the title on a white label and affixed it to the spine and cover of the binder. It read, Case File Kevin Riley, Potential Federal Wire and Bank Fraud. It was no longer a collection of papers. It was a formal indictment, a professional dossier detailing the financial life and crimes of my son-in-law. Back home, I walked into my study. I knelt down and turned the dial on my old safe. The tumblers clicked into place with a familiar sound. I swung the heavy steel door open. The inside was mostly empty, just a few old property deeds and my wife's jewelry box. I took everything out, leaving the dusty interior completely bare. Then I took the heavy binder, the case file, and I placed it squarely in the center of the safe. It was the only thing inside. I looked at it for a long moment. Kevin believed this safe held his treasure, his easy inheritance, the cash that would solve all his problems. He was wrong. The safe did hold a treasure, but it wasn't mine. It was the truth. A truth that was now a loaded weapon waiting patiently in the dark for him to walk in and pull the trigger. I swung the heavy door shut. The locking bolt slid home with a deep final thud. The trap was armed. The fortress was built and the trap was armed. All that was left was to wait. I didn't have to wait long. For 2 weeks, there was a tense silence. The Sunday visits stopped. Sarah called once, her voice strained, saying Kevin was working on a big deadline. I knew it was a lie. He was running out of time. His creditors were closing in. I could almost feel his desperation radiating across the city. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always do the predictable thing. They leap at the one target they believe to be the weakest. The footage from the small dome camera in my study was even more damning than I could have hoped. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. The house was completely dark, silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the hallway. It was Kevin. He moved with a clumsy sort of stealth, a man unaccustomed to physical effort, his every step a potential betrayal. I watched on the recording as he froze when a floorboard creaked under his weight. His head snapping towards my bedroom door, his breath held in a panicked stillness. He thought I was deeply asleep, aided by the heart medication I took every night, a fact he had surely counted on. He crept into my study, a small flashlight held in his trembling hand. The narrow beam danced across my desk, my bookshelf, the photos of my wife, and a younger, happier Sarah. He ignored them all. His target was the heavy mahogany desk where I kept my papers. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently pulled on the handle of the top left drawer. He knew exactly where I kept the spare key to the safe. He had watched me open it a dozen times. The drawer slid open with a soft, woody sigh. The camera's infrared lens showed the contents in ghostly black and white. A few old pens, some paper clips, a roll of stamps, and sitting right on top, the small brass key. But it wasn't alone. Lying next to it was a freshly printed 4x6 photograph. On the recording, I saw Kevin pause. His hand hovered over the key. He angled his flashlight down to get a better look at the picture. Even in the grainy footage, I knew what he was seeing. It was a screenshot I had taken and printed that very afternoon. It was a copy of a final notice email from a high-interest lender addressed to him. The subject line, even in black and white, screamed with urgency. Account in default. Immediate action required. It was one of the many debts I had uncovered in my investigation. I had placed it there as a final warning, a silent signal for him to turn back, to walk away. It was a chance for him to stop, to reconsider the abyss he was about to leap into. I watched as his shoulders slumped. He snatched the photo, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He looked around the dark room as if expecting me to step out of the shadows. How? I could almost hear him whisper. How could I possibly know about this? For a full 10 seconds he was paralyzed. He was standing at a crossroads. One path led back out the door into the night to face the consequences of his own making. The other path led to my safe. Then I saw the shift. His desperation, a more powerful force than his fear, took over. He shook his head, a quick, dismissive gesture. He probably told himself it was a bizarre coincidence, a piece of mail I had somehow intercepted. He couldn't allow himself to believe the truth because the truth was too terrifying that I knew, that I was waiting for him. He stuffed the photograph into his pocket, grabbed the key, and quietly closed the drawer. He had been given his final warning, and he had ignored it. He stood up and turned towards the old steel safe in the corner. He had made his choice. On the security footage, I watched him approach the safe like a man approaching an altar. He knelt, his movements clumsy with a combination of greed and fear. He inserted the brass key into the lock. It made a scraping sound in the silent room, a sound that seemed to echo with the finality of his decision. He turned the key, and the locking mechanism disengaged with a heavy, satisfying clunk. He pulled on the handle, and the thick steel door groaned open, its hinges protesting after years of disuse. This was the moment his entire desperate plan had been leading up to. He aimed the thin, shaky beam of his phone's flashlight into the dark interior. And then he froze. I could see the confusion on his face, even in the grainy infrared image. He was expecting stacks of $100 bills, maybe old savings bonds, gold coins, the stereotypical hoard of a distrustful old man. He expected a treasure. Instead, the flashlight beam illuminated nothing but empty gray steel, and sitting alone in the very center, a single thick 3-ring binder. He reached in hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the plain plastic cover as if he feared it might burn him. He pulled it out. It was heavier than he expected. He angled the light onto the cover, his brow furrowed. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the words on the label, the words I had so carefully printed. Case file Kevin Riley. The color drained from his face. It was a visible physical reaction, like a switch being flipped. He went from a greedy thief to a terrified child in a single heartbeat. His hands trembled as he opened the binder. He didn't start at the beginning. He ripped through the pages frantically, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The camera couldn't see the pages, but I knew what he was seeing. He was seeing his own face staring back at him from copies of his driver's license. He was seeing his own signature, a confident, arrogant scrawl on the bottom of the fraudulent PPP loan application. He was seeing the printed-out furious words of the investors he had scammed, their accusations and threats compiled and cataloged. He was seeing the intricate web of lies he had spent years weaving, all of it untangled, laid bare, and presented to him as a formal indictment under the single pathetic beam of his phone's flashlight. He sank back on his heels, the open binder resting on his lap like a tombstone. He looked utterly, hopelessly defeated. That was my cue. I had been standing in the darkened hallway just outside the study door, my own phone in my hand, recording. I stepped into the doorway, my old slippers making no sound on the hardwood floor. He was so consumed by his horror that he didn't even notice me too. "Find what you were looking for, Kevin," I asked. My voice was quiet, conversational, but it sliced through the silence of the room like a razor blade. He screamed a short, strangled yelp of pure terror and scrambled backward, dropping the binder. The pages spilled across the floor in a cascade of white. His flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam now pointing at the ceiling, casting wild, dancing shadows across the room. He stared at me, his eyes wide in the gloom, his mouth opening and closing, like a fish pulled from water. He saw the phone in my hand. He saw the small, malevolent red light in the corner of the screen, the light that told him this moment was being captured, that it was real and undeniable. Jack, he stammered, his mind racing for an excuse for any lie that could possibly fit the insanity of this moment. He pushed himself up, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "I thought I heard a noise," he blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "I was worried about you. I came to check, and I saw the safe was open. I was just making sure everything was all right." It was a pathetic lie, so flimsy and transparent that it was in itself a profound insult. A cold fury, pure and harder than anything I had ever felt, rose up in me. I took a slow step into the room. "Don't," I said, and the single word cut him off instantly. My voice was low, but it carried the weight of every lie, every dollar, every sleepless night he had ever caused. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence again. Not tonight. Not ever again." I raised my phone slightly, making sure the camera had a clear view of his face. "I think you've had enough of the dark, Kevin. Let's have a little light on the subject." I walked over to my desk and switched on the small green banker's lamp. A warm, focused pool of light illuminated the mess on the floor, the scattered pages of his indictment. He flinched, as if the light itself was an accusation. He stood there, cornered between the empty safe and the evidence of his crimes. "You weren't checking on my safety," I continued, my voice calm, methodical, the voice of an auditor presenting his findings. "You were here to steal from me. You believe that safe contained my life savings. You believe you have a right to it. You believe I am a foolish old man you can manipulate and discard." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. "You are wrong on all counts." I gestured with my phone towards the papers on the floor. "That is what the safe contained. Not my treasure. Yours. The full accounting of your life, Kevin." Let's talk about the CARES Act. It's the federal legislation that funded the Paycheck Protection Program. I imagine you're familiar with it since you received $150,000 from it. What you might not be familiar with are the penalties for providing false information on the application. Are you aware that PPP loan fraud can carry a sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $1 million? His face, already pale, seemed to crumble. The last bit of arrogant bluster drained out of him, leaving behind the hollowed-out shell of a terrified man. He knew in that moment that this wasn't just a family argument. He hadn't been caught by a frail father-in-law. He had been caught by an expert, and he had just walked willingly into a perfectly constructed, inescapable trap. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was Kevin's ragged breathing. I saw a sequence of emotions play across his face. The initial shock gave way to a dawning, bottomless horror. But underneath that, as he realized that every escape route had been sealed, a new emotion began to curdle, pure animalistic rage. When a man like Kevin, who has built his entire life on lies and charm, is stripped of his ability to manipulate, all that is left is the ugly, brutish core. His fear burned away, and what remained was the anger of a cornered predator. His eyes narrowed. His shoulders tensed, and he lowered himself into a slight crouch, like a wolf preparing to spring. "You old fool," he snarled, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "You think you've won. You think you can ruin me." He took a step towards me, his hands clenching into fists. His plan was clear. If he couldn't talk his way out, he would try to smash his way out. He would take my phone, destroy the evidence in the room, and then invent a story about a confused old man having a fall. It was his last desperate move. But I had anticipated this. I didn't flinch. I didn't take a step back. I simply held his gaze, my own expression unreadable. "Before you do something you will regret even more than you regret tonight," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "There is one more thing you should know." My calmness seemed to enrage him further, but it also made him hesitate. He stopped a few feet away from me. "That binder," I said, nodding towards the papers scattered at his feet, "is a physical copy. A prop, you might say, for this little drama of ours. The real file, the complete digital dossier with all the evidence, the video from this camera, and a signed, notarized affidavit from me detailing tonight's events, was uploaded to a secure server 2 hours ago." I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand. Think of it as an insurance policy, Kevin, I explained slowly, as if to a child. When I uploaded that file, I sent a link to my lawyer, David Sterling. That email is sitting in his inbox right now. Attached to that email is a command set on a timer. If I do not enter a specific code on my phone by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning exactly, 6 hours and 41 minutes from now, that command will automatically execute, and the email with the complete unredacted file will be irrevocably forwarded to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Pennsylvania. The only person on this planet who has that code, the only person who can stop that email from being sent is me. I let the words sink in. I watched his face as the full implication of what I had said dawned on him. His fists slowly uncurled. The rage in his eyes was replaced by a new, more profound and utterly hopeless despair. His physical threat was meaningless. If he laid a hand on me, if he so much as bruised my arm, he would be ensuring that the email would be sent. He would be punching his own ticket to a federal penitentiary. I had taken his last move off the board. Checkmate. He just stood there swaying slightly, a puppet with its strings cut. He was finally completely and utterly broken. Now, I said, my voice softening slightly, I think it's time we included my daughter in this conversation. His head snapped up, a new wave of panic in his eyes. No, he whispered. Don't. Please, Jack. Not Sarah. This has always been about Sarah, I replied. I looked down at my phone, which was still recording, and my thumb moved across the screen. I navigated away from the video app and pressed the icon for a video call. The ringing filled the tense silence of the study, each tone an impossibly loud announcement of the coming reckoning. After 3 rings, the call connected. Sarah's face appeared on my screen. She was in bed, her hair messy, her face soft with sleep. She looked confused and concerned. Dad, she said, her voice thick with sleep. What is it? Is everything okay? It's the middle of the night. My entire demeanor shifted. The cold, hard prosecutor was gone, replaced by the gentle, worried father. Sarah, honey, I said, my voice full of warmth and concern. I'm so sorry to wake you, but I need you to come over to the house right away. What's wrong? She asked, sitting up now, fully awake. Are you hurt? Did you fall? No, I'm fine, I reassured her. But something has happened, something important. And your husband, Kevin, he's here with me. There's something he needs to explain. To both of us. Can you please just get dressed and come over? I need you here. Kevin's there, she asked, her confusion deepening. But he's right here in bed next to... Oh my God. I could hear the rustle of sheets as she turned to find the empty space beside her. Just come over, sweetheart, I said gently. Then I did the final necessary and most brutal thing. I panned my phone's camera away from my own face. I turned it towards the scene in my study. Through my screen, I saw what she was now seeing. She was seeing her husband Kevin standing pale and defeated, a ghost in the lamplight. She was seeing the open, empty safe behind him, its door hanging ajar like a gaping wound. And she was seeing the floor at his feet, littered with the white pages of the case file that bore his name. I held the camera there, steady, letting the image burn itself into her memory. I watched her face on my screen as her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then finally to the first cracks of a devastating and world-shattering understanding. It felt like an eternity before I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the engine cutting out abruptly. A car door slammed shut, and a moment later, the front door of the house burst open. Sarah ran into the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. She was still in her pajamas with a coat thrown hastily over them. Her gaze flew past me and landed on Kevin, standing amidst the scattered papers like a man shipwrecked on an island of his own making. Before I could say a word, Kevin saw his chance. He lunged not at me but at her, his last and most powerful shield. He threw his hands up in a gesture of utter desperation. "Sarah, thank God!" he cried, his voice cracking with a masterful theatrical panic. "You have to help me, your father. He's lost his mind. He's gone crazy." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "He lured me over here talking about a break-in. It was a trap. He's been printing things off the internet, making up these wild stories. He thinks I'm some kind of criminal. Look at this." He gestured wildly at the mess on the floor. "He's not well, Sarah. We need to call someone. We need to get him help." It was a brilliant, despicable performance. He was trying to turn the situation from a criminal confession into a medical emergency with me as the patient. Sarah looked from his frantic face to my calm one, her own expression, a mask of confusion and fear. She was caught in the crossfire, and her instinct was to believe her husband. I held up a hand, a simple placating gesture. "Sarah," I said, my voice gentle, completely devoid of the anger from moments before. "I know this is confusing, and I am so sorry to do this to you. But he's not going to get help by lying anymore. I'm not going to get help by pretending anymore. All I ask is that you stand right there and you listen. You don't have to believe me. Just listen to the facts." I knelt down my old knees, protesting, and began to gather the scattered pages. I was no longer an accuser. I was a presenter. This was my living room, but it had become my courtroom. I picked up 2 specific sheets of paper. I stood up and walked over to my daughter, holding them out for her. "This," I said, pointing to the first page, "is a copy of the application for a Paycheck Protection Program loan filed by Riley Innovations LLC 2 years ago. As you can see, the requested amount was $150,000. And right here it states the company employs 15 people. And this," I said, pointing to his familiar confident signature at the bottom, "is your husband's name." I then held up the second sheet. "And this is the official payroll tax filing from the state for the same company for the same year. As you can see right here in this box, the number of employees is listed as 0. It has been listed as 0 for the entire 5 years the company has existed." I didn't say he lied. I didn't say this is fraud. I just held the 2 documents side by side. "Both of these documents cannot be true, Sarah. One of them is a lie submitted to the federal government." I dropped those pages and picked up a printout from one of the investor forums. "This is a post from a woman named Eleanor Vance, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio." I said, my voice quiet. I read her words aloud. "I gave Mr. Riley my entire retirement fund, $40,000. He promised me it was a safe investment in green energy that would help me pay for my husband's medical bills. I haven't heard from him in 6 months. The phone number is disconnected. I don't know what to do. He has ruined my life." I picked up another page. "This is an email from Kevin to that same woman sent a week before she invested. Look," I said, holding it out for Sarah to see. "He's promising her a 300% return in under a year. An impossible predatory lie designed to prey on her hope." I let the paper fall to the floor. I didn't need to show her any more. The truth was now in the room, a living, breathing entity more real and more solid than any of Kevin's lies had ever been. Sarah had been looking at the papers, but now her gaze lifted to her husband's face. Her expression was no longer confused. It was shattered. The final conflict, the final judgment, was not mine to deliver. It was hers. Tears began to stream down her face, silent and hot. Her voice was a broken whisper. "Kevin," she said, and his name sounded like a prayer and a curse. "Look at me." He couldn't. His eyes darted around the room, from the safe to the floor, to me anywhere but at his wife. "Kevin, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Just look at me and tell me it's not true. Tell me my father is lying. Tell me this is all just some horrible, insane mistake." She was giving him one last chance. One final opportunity to construct a lie that she could cling to, a thread she could use to try and stitch their life back together. All he had to do was look her in the eye and deny it. But he couldn't. He opened his mouth and a small strangled sound came out, but no words followed. He stared at a spot on the wall just over her shoulder, his jaw working silently. He didn't have to say a word. His silence was the loudest confession I had ever heard. It was the sound of a hollow man finally admitting he was empty. And in that silence I watched my daughter's heart break. The sound of my daughter's quiet sobbing was the only thing that filled the room. Kevin stood frozen, a statue of a man, finally stripped of all his lies. The performance was over. It was time for the sentencing. I walked over to the briefcase I had placed by the door when I first came into the study. I opened it and took out 2 documents, which I had placed in a neat manila folder. I walked to the coffee table in the center of the living room, a space where we had shared so many family moments, so many carefully constructed lies. I placed the 2 documents on the polished wood surface side by side. Then I placed a black fountain pen neatly on top of them. Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face a question. Kevin's eyes were fixed on the papers as if they were coiled snakes. "The first document," I said, my voice calm and clear, breaking the painful silence, "is a petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. My lawyer drafted them this morning. They are quite simple. They state that all marital assets will revert to their original owner, and you will make no future claims on my daughter's finances, inheritance, or property." I tapped the second document. "This one is a full and detailed confession. It has also been prepared by my lawyer. It outlines the fraudulent application for the Paycheck Protection Program loan. It details the investor scams related to your shell company, FutureVest Global. It is a complete admission of guilt for the federal crimes you have committed. It is concise, accurate, and legally binding." I then looked directly at Kevin, and for the first time all night he was forced to meet my gaze. There was nothing left in his eyes. No anger, no fear, just a hollow, empty void. "You have 2 choices," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "This is the last decision you will ever get to make in connection with this family. Path number 1. You will sign both of these documents right now. You will then go to your home, pack a single bag, and you will walk out of my daughter's life forever. You will never call her, text her, or contact her in any way ever again. In exchange for your signature and your complete disappearance, I will make a phone call and I will cancel the 8 a.m. appointment your future has with the United States Attorney's Office. You will walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back, but you will be free." I let that sink in before I presented the alternative. Path number 2. You refuse to sign. You call my bluff. You can walk out of this house right now, and at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, when that email is automatically sent, your life will cease to be your own. It will belong to the federal justice system. You will face a trial, and with the evidence in that binder, you will be convicted. You will go to prison for a very, very long time. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "And just so we are crystal clear, Kevin, just so you don't get any ideas about trying to win Sarah back later to get to her money, all of my assets, this house, my portfolio, everything have been placed into an irrevocable trust. The terms of that trust, which I signed last week, explicitly state that my daughter cannot access the principal of her inheritance as long as she is legally married to you. There is nothing left for you here, not a single penny. The bank is closed." I stood back up straight. The choice was his. A life of freedom in exile or a life in a cage. I had taken everything from him, his wife, his future, his lies. And in return, I was offering him the one thing he didn't deserve, a chance to walk away. The pen lay on the table between us. The entire future of our family was balanced on its small, sharp point. Kevin took the pen. In the crushing silence of the room, the only sound was the scratching of his signature, first on the confession, then on the divorce papers. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at me. He placed the pen back on the table, turned, and walked out of the house without a word. I made the call, and the 8 a.m. email was canceled. Just like that, like a ghost in the night, he was gone. The months that followed were quiet. The healing was slow, and it was not easy. There were tears, and there was a profound, aching silence where 20 years of a shared life used to be. But slowly, a new kind of normal began to grow in the space that the lies had left behind. We find ourselves now at my kitchen table on a sunny Saturday morning. The light streams in the same light from that first morning I began my investigation, but it feels different now. Warmer. Cleaner. On the table between us is not a fancy meal, but the annual report of a publicly traded company. I have a cup of coffee. Sarah has a cup of tea. Her brow is furrowed in concentration, not in sadness. Look here, I say, my finger tracing a line on the balance sheet. See their debt-to-equity ratio. It's been climbing for 3 straight quarters. But their press releases all talk about expansion. What story do those 2 facts tell you when you put them together? She is quiet for a long moment, studying the numbers. Then she looks up at me and her eyes are clear sharp. They're borrowing to fuel their growth, she says. They're expanding faster than their revenue can support. It's a house of cards. I smile. A real, genuine smile. Exactly, I say. A house of cards. In that moment, she looks at me, and I can see something shift in her gaze. For the first time in so many years, she is not looking at a frail, elderly father who needs to be managed or placated. She is seeing the man I used to be, the man I still am. She is seeing a protector, a teacher. She is seeing a father who loved her enough to risk her hatred in order to save her from a slow, creeping ruin. A silent giant who had stood guard over her life even when she hadn't known it. Her own smile is small and a little sad, but it is real, and it is a new beginning. I spent my entire life searching for the truth in columns of numbers, in ledgers, and in balance sheets. I believed that if you could just make the numbers add up, you could understand the world. But on that long, terrible night, I learned that the most important truth isn't found in a case file. It's found in the freedom of someone you love. My safe wasn't empty after all. It never was. It held the most valuable asset I ever possessed, a gift more precious than any amount of money. It held the truth. And that truth finally set my daughter free. This story teaches a powerful lesson. True protection for those we love often demands that we create the very conflict we have spent years trying to avoid. Jack's desire for peace allowed a web of deceit to grow, but his decision to seek the truth, no matter how painful, was his greatest act of fatherly love. He proved that the most valuable inheritance isn't money held in a trust, but wisdom and self-reliance shared across a kitchen table. Ultimately, the story shows that real strength is the courage to present a difficult truth that empowers others to find their own freedom. Share with us in the comments, what do you believe is the most powerful lesson a parent can pass on to their children?